in the main headquarters. This is something which he undertakes personally, and I think Mr. Arnold is actually going to be in Thailand at some point in the near future, albeit not in Bangkok. I think he's going to give a different presentation. So he does go around the world a lot doing this kind of thing himself. I'm going to start this presentation with a short video clip from him.
I'm responsible for development and administration of ADRSM's work in all countries outside the UK and Ireland. Here in the international department, we make examination arrangements and organise examiner travel, accommodation and briefing, as well as trying to find ways of serving teachers, parents and candidates more effectively. We work very closely with our network of representatives across the world to ensure each candidate will enjoy their exam as much as possible. I, like many of my colleagues, have also worked as a teacher, performer and examiner, and I often travel to our international centres to meet with teachers, pupils and representatives and to deliver professional development seminars for teachers, something that is very important to all of us at ADRSM. Working with our representatives and consultants around the world, we aim to celebrate musical achievement worldwide. Our overriding concern is to provide help and support for teachers and candidates, and so I do hope that you'll enjoy this presentation today.
I thought I'd start by just telling you the process that you're going to hear today. We have two sections of this presentation, and they're quite separate from each other. For that reason, I propose to have a short break, maybe 5 or 10 minutes in between each section, so you have a chance to reflect on what we've talked about and have a breath of fresh air for a few minutes. I would ask that when we do break, that you don't disappear for too long, just maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And that will be in about 3/4 of an hour's time, around 11 o'clock, something like that. Okay? The first section of today's presentation is going to be focusing on the sight reading, and we've decided to call it At First Sight. Inspiring Achievement is the second section, and that will be looking at the performances that your candidates give between grades 1 and 5. It will probably focus mostly on piano and violin, because I understand from Mr. Eddy and from others that that is the majority of teachers here, specialist areas. So that will be our focus for the second part of this. Sight reading, of course, being a very important component of the exams, and we've decided to target on this, focus on that particular area today for your interest and for you to pass on some of this to your pupils. Let's just have a little look at the list of bullet points on that first slide. I'm hoping that you can all read it. Those of you at the back, I'll read out each of these for you, and then you can have a few seconds to think about them. First of all, what is the point of sight reading? A question that your candidates, your pupils may well have asked you at various points. How to teach sight reading, how to prepare for sight reading, as from the candidate's perspective, and finally, of course, what are the examiners looking for when the thing happens for real in the exam room?
ฮัลโหลสวัสดีนะครับนิดนึงนะครับพอดีเมื่อกี้นี้ให้อาจารย์พูดเลยเดี๋ยวถามนิดนึงว่าใครยกตามตรงเลยนะครับใครต้องการทำแปลครับจะได้ทราบลักษณะกับจำนวนณตอนนี้ประมาณยกเลยนะครับเดี๋ยวผมจะได้ประเมิน1 2 3 4 5โอเคก็ประมาณสัก 10% จากจำนวน 10-20% นะครับงั้นเดี๋ยวผมจะช็อตให้แล้วก็จะเบรกเป็นช่วงๆนะครับแล้วก็พยายามที่จะสรุปให้แล้วกันเพราะอาจารย์จะได้ไม่ไปอินทรัพไม่ไปหยุดการพูดของอาจารย์นะครับโอเคครับ Let me read a little bit after this pointขอที่ดังนิดนึงของคุณโอเคครับครับจริงๆแล้วเมื่อกี้นี้สรุปคร่าวๆนะครับที่อาจารย์ที่ Professor Tanner พูดมาก็คือแนะนำ Mr. Tim Arnold นะครับซึ่งเดี๋ยวเราจะมีสัมมนาที่เชียงใหม่ในต้นเดือนหน้านะครับเราจะมีคนที่เข้ามาสัมมนานี้ประมาณเกือบ100 คนทีเดียวนะครับแนะนำให้มี presentation หรือมี seminar แบบนี้เพื่อที่จะก่อให้เกิดfeedback เพื่อจะให้การ support นะครับหรือว่าช่วยให้คุณครูแล้วก็ผู้เข้าสอบเนี่ยหรือนักเรียนเนี่ยได้ทำคะแนนให้ดีขึ้นนะครับใน area ต่างๆสิ่งที่อาจารย์จะโฟกัส2 เรื่องในวันนี้นะครับ section แรกคือการทำยังไงถึงจะ sight reading ได้ดีขึ้นนะครับจุดต่างๆเหล่านี้ professor ต้องการที่จะชี้ให้เราเห็นว่าทำยังไงถึงจะเตรียมตัวผู้เข้าสอบให้ดีขึ้นในเรื่องของ sight reading จากนั้นเราจะมีเบรกสั้นๆแล้วก็ครึ่งหลังจะกลายเป็นการเตรียมเพลงสอบเกรด 1-5 นะครับมีจุดต่างๆที่จะทำให้เราสามารถเตรียมตัวแล้วก็ให้นักเรียนได้คะแนนดีขึ้นด้วยนะครับก็คงมีเท่านี้ก่อนนะครับเดี๋ยวไปตาม4 หัวข้อที่อยู่ใน bullet point ใน presentation นะครับ
I should also say that I'm happy to answer some questions about sight reading at the end of this section in 45 minutes time. And then we can sort of draw a line under the sight reading aspect of this presentation. As I say, have the break and then move on to the next section about the pieces and the performances. Okay, so first of all, what is the point of sight reading? We assume, don't we, as teachers, that this is very obvious. As teachers, we're probably quite good at sight reading. We're probably quite good at learning pieces fairly quickly. But it's not always the case that our pupils understand the full importance of being a good sight reader. From my personal perspective, I feel that if you are able to learn a piece very quickly, or at least get the bare outline of that piece in your mind, then you can begin the enjoyable process of getting to the detail of the music and reaching an enjoyable, attractive performance much more quickly. The process of playing an instrument such as the piano, but certainly not only the piano, is riddled with technical problems, musical problems, notational problems. And sight reading actually is a connecting together of all of those aspects, isn't it? When you sit down at an instrument to sight read, you're actually having to do all of those things. You're having to assimilate all of those things very, very quickly. So I think that sight reading is extremely important. I'm very glad to see that it is a focal point of the grade exams, and in a more extended version, you could say that it also takes a place in the diploma examinations in the form of a quick study. And those of you who know anything about the diplomas will know that you have a 5-minute period in which to learn a piece, not to sight read it, but to learn it, and then to present it so that it sounds something like a performance. And that process starts right with your younger pupils at the lower end of the scale, as it were, of grades. So if you can encourage them to be confident and competent at sight reading right from grade 1, this is something they can carry with them all the way through to grade 8. And then you'll find that when you put a new piece in front of them, or if you want them to choose between 2 or 3 pieces in the list C pieces, for example, then that process is so much more quickly done, because they, after a week of playing through those pieces, they have a sense of what they are. They know what they are choosing between. Okay? If you're a trumpeter, a flute player, a singer, sight reading within the context of a choir or a band or an orchestra is something we all accept. We take it for granted. Conductors hand out music to everybody. They say 3, 4, and they go. And everybody assumes that this is an integral part of being a good musician if you play an orchestral instrument or a band instrument. For piano, that assumption tends not to be made, because piano players do not play in orchestras, or at least not until they're rather more advanced. And therefore, we may overlook this aspect of playing. So I think that you probably already are quite converted to the notion of sight reading. And I doubt if there's anybody in this room who thinks that sight reading is not important. But I would encourage you at every opportunity to make sure your students really understand the importance of that. Okay? When they see you sight reading, perhaps a piece you've never come across before, you put it in front of you and you demonstrate it. This is another way of showing them how important it is that you are able to do that. Okay? So, in my experience, if you are a good sight reader yourself, you will prioritise that in your own lessons. If you don't feel very confident yourself as a teacher in your sight reading, this may be something that you overlook in your own teaching. I've said this lots of times to other teaching groups. The teacher's priorities tend to be the pupil's priorities. Okay? So if you overlook certain things, then you can expect your pupils to overlook them, and you can expect those components of an exam to be not quite as polished as the other components of the exam. So we can learn pieces much more quickly. We can be more confident, therefore, in the exam room, and we can acquire a skill and a hobby for life. It's worth saying, isn't it, that the reason that most of your pupils learn the piano or the violin or the bassoon is not because they're going to become professional musicians. It's not because they're going to go and do a degree in music, and it's not because they're going to become a music teacher. Most of them, 99.99% of them, will be doing it for the fun of doing it. It's something that they will take with them for the rest of their lives. Even the very, very best ones, the ones who come away with a high distinction at grade 8, small percentage of course, many of those will not do music as a profession. And sometimes when I've been teaching in England, I've come across people who are very, very good musicians who would be able to take up a place in the profession, and then they tell me they're going off to university to do engineering or science or accounting or whatever. And that's the way it is. So most of the time you're going to be dealing with people for whom music is going to be a fun, enriching experience, but not going to be their profession. Okay? So the better they can sight read, the more fun they can have. When I was a small boy, I used to have a pile of music that I inherited from some friends and relatives. And most of my practice sessions were not really practicing at all. I was a rather naughty boy. And I used to get my music and put it on the stand and just sight read through lots of things. And that meant that I was not frightened of the appearance of music. I overcame that fear. In fact, instead of seeing it as a scary proposition, I saw it as a fun, challenging experience. And I think that's a really important way of communicating that to your students, You know, sight reading is not a scary thing. It shouldn't be. It should be something that they think, great, this is my opportunity to show you, the examiner, that I can get this piece quite quickly under my fingers or in my voice. Yeah? And that comes down to you to encourage them to do that. So I think we've said enough on that subject. Would you like to fill in that?
สรุปสั้นๆนะครับอาจารย์พูดว่าจุดที่ต้องการ sight reading เนี่ยจะทำให้นักเรียนเนี่ยมีความเข้าใจในตัวเพลงได้ดีขึ้นนะครับถ้าเราสามารถที่จะเข้าใจในตัวเพลงได้ดีขึ้นทำให้มีอยู่4 area ที่อาจารย์พูดนะครับเวลาเราอ่านโน้ตเนี่ยมีด้านของเทคนิคด้านมิวสิกด้าน notation ก็คือการอ่านโน้ตอ่านจังหวะแล้วก็ด้านต่างๆเหล่านี้เนี่ย4 เรื่องนี้รวมกันทำให้เกิดเป็นความสนุกนะครับอาจารย์พยายามจะใช้คำว่าถ้าเราอ่านดนตรีได้อ่านโน้ตได้ sight reading ได้ก็จะทำให้เราเนี่ยสามารถที่จะไม่กลัวไม่มีความตื่นเต้นมากเกินไปนะครับขอให้มีลักษณะในการโน้มน้าวเด็กให้มีความสนุกในการอยากทำ sight reading ไม่ใช่ไปบอกขู่เขาให้กลัวให้น่ากลัวถึงแม้จะท้าทายแต่ถ้าทำทุกวันทำวันละนิดทำวันละหน่อยเดี๋ยวก็ชินเองเหมือนเราอ่านหนังสือครับพออ่านหนังสือออกสะกดคำเป็นก็อยากอ่านนู่นอ่านนี่นะครับเพราะฉะนั้นตรงนี้จำเป็นจะต้องให้ฝึกฝนทำตั้งแต่เกรด 1 จนถึงเกรด 8แล้วการ sight reading ดีจนถึงขั้นดิโพลมาขั้นดิโพลมานี่ไม่เรียกว่า sight reading เรียกว่า quick study quick study คือต้องให้เวลา5 นาทีในการเรียนโน้ตคือมองเลยไม่ใช่แค่ sight read อย่างช่วงเด็กเกรด 1 ถึง 8นะครับเพราะฉะนั้นทักษะนี้จำเป็นและสำคัญตั้งแต่เล็กไปจนโตนะครับจากนั้นการเลือก sight reading เนี่ยให้เด็กเลือกหรือครูเลือกก็ได้นะครับบางทีเราเปิดโน้ตขึ้นมาเด็กๆเขามองหน้าตาโน้ตไม่รู้เรื่องหรอกครับอาจจะเล่นเกมกันเลือกมา1ครูเลือกให้1แล้วก็ลองกลับไปทำให้มันเป็นเกมหรือทำอะไรให้สนุกขึ้นก็ได้นะครับการ sight reading เนี่ยในเรื่องของเปียโนจะยากหน่อยเพราะมันมี2 มือแต่ถ้าเกิดว่าโดยทั่วไปถ้าเป็นนักร้องในวงประสานเสียงเนี่ยทุกคน sight read โน้ตได้เอากลับไปอ่านโน้ตร้องเป็นทำนองอันนั้นก็จะน่าสนุกแต่ว่าใน area ที่เราเน้นคือเรื่องของเปียโนเป็นหลักเพราะเปียโนมี2 มือครับอันนั้นคือในกิจกรรม1แล้วก็ถ้าคนที่เป็นครูต้องไม่ละเลยนะครับพวกเรามักจะละเลย sight reading ไปทำเองไม่ได้นะครับอย่า overlook ต้องเป็นส่วนหนึ่งของการเรียนการสอนให้สม่ำเสมอเพื่อเด็กจะได้ทำให้เป็นนิสัยนะครับจากนั้นก็อาจารย์เล่าถึงตอนเด็กๆนะครับอาจารย์ก็เอาโน้ตมาอ่านทุกวันเลยนะครับเยอะมีโน้ตเป็นตั้งเลยนะฮะก็ทำให้มีความสนุกสนานในการอ่านตรงนี้ได้นะครับก็มาถึงจุดตรงนี้แล้วนะครับอย่าทำให้น่ากลัวทำให้ท้าทายทำให้สนุกเหมือนเป็นการเล่นเกมนะครับ
So let's get into some more specific detail. I'm sure I'm speaking to a converted audience in terms of the need for sight reading, and indeed the fact that you are all here today, I think is a demonstration that you are willing to understand things, to think about things in a way which is going to be helpful to your candidates, your pupils, who are my candidates of course, in future times. So let's get into some basic components of what sight reading is and how you can actually teach it in a meaningful way. Essentially, we're talking about notes and we're talking about rhythms. Now, I'm not going to say that one is definitely more of a priority than the other, and clearly a good sight reading test, well played, is going to need to have a strong rhythmic component, and it's going to have to be fairly accurate in terms of notes. We'll look at a little bit more detail about reading notes, melodic patterns, understanding the rhythmic patterns, and then combining rhythm patterns with notes in a steady pulse to convey a piece in a meaningful way. Now, reading notes, how can we go about doing that in a way which is actually going to be profitable for students? Actually, I think I'll move it to the previous page. Reading notes, first of all, make sure that all of your candidates, all of your pupils, know all of the note names, even at grade 1 level. It's surprising the number of pupils who learn by rote, by teachers demonstrating pieces they don't really use the book to read from. In fact, I quite often find that students come in to do an exam, they bring the music with them, we put it on the music stand, and they never actually look at it once in the whole time they're there. Now, this could mean that they learned the piece from the book and have now memorised it, or it could mean that they never used the book in the first place. They just learned it by the process of absorption, watching you play, looking at YouTube clips, and what have you. So it is important that you don't assume they know things like note names, okay? So do make sure that they are all known, and also that they know where to locate them on the instrument, okay? At prep test level, I quite often find I have to help young people to locate the first note of the right hand and the left hand in order for them to stand a good chance of playing their tunes and their two pieces. At grade 1 level, I'm not in a position to do that. Examiner is examining partly their ability to do that themselves. So through good teaching on your behalf, that has to be done. So this has to be an instantaneous process. If you can find fun ways of communicating this in your lessons, this would be greatly advantageous. Some teachers use flashcards. There are various apps that you can get from the App Store now. And there are various games and ways that you can integrate note name finding and locating on the instrument, so that this process becomes very automatic and they're not having to do this kind of thing. And I still see a certain amount of that in a sight reading test, which means that the student is not automatically understanding the note names, and the process of translating from the page to the instrument to sound is not an automatic one. Okay, so sight reading is not going to be very good in the hands of somebody who is operating in that way. Okay, so get the thing really instantaneous. And you can teach them melodic patterns and note patterns by virtue of scales and arpeggios. I don't wish to start talking in any depth about scales and arpeggios, but I think it goes without saying, doesn't it, that all pieces, certainly up into the 20th century, make very, very extensive use of scales and arpeggios. They're everywhere we look, and use scales and arpeggios as an integrated way of demonstrating to your pupils the importance of them understanding melodic patterns, okay, intervals between notes. You can do this actually in a very connected up way with the pieces, incidentally, because you can say to them, look at the first 4 notes in your piece. They're made up of a scale. They go from C to D to E to F, whatever it might be. Get them to actually understand that there is a connection between a scale or an arpeggio and a piece of music, and get them to be so familiar with these patterns that when they see them within the context of a sight reading test, it's not new to them. It's a series of notes walking up the stairs, going back down again, okay? So that's a really important thing for them to know. Would you like to fill them in on that, please?
Okay, ครับผมสรุปตามที่อาจารย์พูดนะครับเมื่อกี้ได้พูดถึงอารมณ์บทไปแล้วว่า sight reading สำคัญยังไงคราวนี้เวลาที่เราจะสอน sight reading เนี่ยอย่างแรกอาจารย์แนะนำในเรื่องของการอ่านโน้ตนะครับ reading notes and melodic patterns เรื่องที่2อ่าน rhythmic patterns เรื่องที่3คือการนำเอามารวมกันตรงนี้เนี่ยเป็นสิ่งที่เป็นหัวใจของการที่จะอธิบาย sight reading ให้เด็กๆได้ฟังนะครับคราวนี้เราเริ่มที่การอ่านโน้ตเนี่ยการอ่านโน้ตส่วนใหญ่แล้วเด็กๆปัญหาคือไม่อ่านจำเพลงตั้งแต่เริ่มต้นที่เรียนเปิดซีดีฟังบ้างฟังที่คุณครูเล่นให้ฟังบ้างดูวิดีโอคลิปต่างๆบ้างดูนู่นดูนี่แล้วจำเลย การจำเลยทำให้เขาไม่รู้โน้ตและทำให้เขาได้ยินเสียงเพราะฉะนั้นเขาจะไม่อ่านแต่เขาพูดตามเราครับเราให้เขาพูดกอไก่ขอไข่เขาพูดกอไก่เขาไม่ได้อ่านออกมาเพราะฉะนั้นปัญหานี้มันเป็นปัญหาตั้งแต่เริ่มต้นนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นให้รู้จักแพทเทิร์นของโน้ต2คือการวางมือว่าโน้ตตรงนั้นเนี่ยวางตรงไหน placement ของมือเนี่ยควรจะวางตรงไหนอย่างเช่นใน prep test เนี่ยให้รู้โน้ตตัวแรกใน middle C เนี่ยเป็นตัวสำคัญใช่ไหมครับเป็นเด็กๆที่อาจารย์ทำให้ดูว่าต้องชี้โน้ตแล้วก็ลงมาหาแบบนี้อันนั้นคือเขาไม่ relate งั้นปัญหาตรงนี้จะแก้ไขได้ด้วยการให้รู้จัก scale และ arpeggio หรือ broken chord เพราะเด็กๆเกรด 1จะใช้แพทเทิร์นตรงนี้นำมาสร้างความสัมพันธ์นะครับเพราะส่วนใหญ่ในเพลง4โน้ตแรกโดเรมีฟาเนี่ยมันมาจาก scale งั้นถ้าเกิดเขาค่อยๆสัมพันธ์ได้ว่าโน้ตที่มันเรียงลำดับแบบนี้ขึ้นลงอย่างนี้ในคีย์ตรงไหนจะทำให้เขาง่ายขึ้นนะครับอันนี้เป็นจุดที่อาจารย์เน้นนะครับอีกอย่างหนึ่งที่สำคัญคือ instantaneous คือจะต้องทำทันทีเห็นโน้ตปุ๊บให้เขากล้าเล่นไม่ใช่มองเด็กสัก10 นาทีแล้วค่อยลงมากดโน้ตนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นให้เขากล้าทำให้อ่านเลยหาให้เจอไกด์เขาบ้างวางมือให้ถูกนะครับก็จะได้มีความรู้สึกกล้าทำตั้งแต่เริ่มต้นนะครับตรงนี้สำคัญมากใช้เครื่องมือต่างๆเช่น flash card หรือมีตารางโน้ต grand staff ไว้ข้างๆให้เขาคอยชี้ดูได้นะครับไม่ถึงจะต้องเรียกออกมาจากหัวสมองมันเด็กมันจะจำอักษรได้หมดใช่ไหมครับเพราะฉะนั้นตรงนี้เป็นสิ่งสำคัญที่จะช่วยให้เขาเนี่ย encourage สนับสนุนให้เขาได้อ่านโน้ตตั้งแต่โน้ตตัวแรกเลยนะครับ
Thank you. Yes, children often learn best when they're having fun. So the more fun you can make these things, and using technology, using ways of integrating their learning so that their pieces, their scales, their sight reading all come together in one logical way of thinking is a really good thing to do. So that when you're teaching a piece, if you come across an arpeggio, you come across a scale, or even a little bit of a scale, or a little bit of a broken chord, just use that as an opportunity to say, by the way, there's a scale there, can you tell me what that scale is? And if you can get them to think in terms of a key, then you really are going to be very much more equipped to do a sight reading test. Quite often I find with sight reading tests in an examination, there's quite a good sense of progression through the piece. Quite a lot of the notes would be accurate had the piece not had a key signature. But the piece does have a key signature and they haven't noticed it. So they're playing all of the F sharps as they should have been as F naturals. They're playing all of the C sharps as C naturals. And it was otherwise quite a good attempt at the sight reading. But because they've missed the key, this is such a fundamental part of the structure of this piece. It's rather like playing a piece in the wrong key. If you were to play a D major piece in D minor, it wouldn't work terribly well. So there are scales and arpeggios to be found all over the place. I can think of a couple off the top of my head. Here you go. Just a couple of little examples of Mozart, how he chooses to start a sonata. Scale, arpeggio. These things are not just for junior level pupils. These are relevant right up to diploma candidates. Okay? So in the pieces that no doubt you choose to play on your instruments, you will still find scales and arpeggios all over the place. So do make sure that they do not go unnoticed and unmentioned in your teaching. Okay? So integrated learning is really the key thing there. In terms of melodic confidence and rhythmic confidence, I personally feel that the rhythmic component is at least as important as the melodic component. Now we have Christmas coming up in about 5 weeks or so. Do you all know your Christmas carols? Do you? Put your hands up if you know some Christmas carols. I can't believe there's only 2 or 3 hands going up. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to sing anything. It's not a problem. I'm sure you know some Christmas carols. This may not work, this little thing I'm going to do for you now. But I want you with a show of hands to see if you can tell me which Christmas carol I am playing here. Does anyone have any idea what Christmas carol it was?
ไม่เป็นไรใครรู้ยกเลยครับ
Yes.
ฟังออกไหมครับมันเป็นมองเพลงอะไรมีใครฟังออกบ้าง
It was actually Once in Royal David City, but you were very close because the intervals are very similar actually for Hark the Herald. So it should actually do something like this. Now, I played all the right notes the first time, but with no rhythm at all. I just made up the rhythm and completely got it wrong. And it means that it's very difficult to actually understand what that tune is. So you can see from an examiner's point of view, even if the pupil plays all of the right notes and gets the rhythm completely wrong, it's fair to say that most of the outline of the music is not really in clear focus. Yeah? So it's not just a case of getting all the right notes and following the key. I played that in F major there and I remembered the B flats. Yes, but if I don't have any rhythm in my playing, then it's still not possible to actually know what that carol is. Let's try another example. I'm going to clap the rhythm of a Christmas carol for you with no notes at all. Again, I want you to put your hands up if you happen to recognise what it is.
ต่อไปอาจารย์จะแค่ตบมือเป็นทำนองนะครับแล้วใครที่จับได้ว่ามันเป็นโน้ตเพลงอะไรนะครับ
You can hear everybody saying Silent Night. Now, why is it that a Christmas carol, which is much more relevant to my culture than to your culture, is immediately recognisable by most of you with no melody, no key, but with the correct rhythm? And yet, the first example was not very recognisable, even though I played all of the right notes and in the right key, within the key. So, this is something that's worth telling to your students, okay? The rhythmic component is at least as important, you could argue even more important. So when examiners talk about the outline of the piece, and you will find examiners using that word, outline, what they really are meaning is the overall shape of the piece. They are referring to the rhythm and to the key and the melodic shapes within that. Okay? A coming together of all of those three things. And it might be that the melodic shape is fairly well understood by the candidate, but the rhythmic shape is not. Sometimes it's the other way around. You get very good rhythmic playing and all of the notes are wrong. I would say it's usually the other way around, because people sometimes feel that at all costs they must get all of the right notes, and they would rather make the examiner wait for 30 seconds for one note than to try to get rhythmic understanding. So let's talk a little bit about rhythm. Rhythmic patterns. I've already talked about melodic patterns, scales and arpeggios. We'll talk a little bit now about rhythmic patterns, but first of all, I think I'll...
อันนี้อาจารย์สรุปในเรื่องสำคัญมากนะครับตรงนี้ก็คือเริ่มตั้งแต่ว่าเด็กๆเวลาใช้ reading เนี่ยอ่านโน้ตผิดอ่านโน้ตถูกตัว fa sharp ตัว b flat ไม่ใส่ต้องหาคีย์ไม่เจออันนี้เป็นปัญหาทั่วไปเพราะเขาไม่เรียนรู้จากการไล่สเกลนะครับเขาจับคีย์ไม่ได้เช่นอาจารย์ยกตัวอย่างเพลงโมซาร์ทขึ้นมาปุ๊บมันส่วนใหญ่มันจะเป็นคอร์ดในบันไดเสียงนั้นๆเพราะฉะนั้นการสร้างให้เด็กมีความสัมพันธ์ว่าโน้ตที่ขึ้นต้น 4-5 ตัวนั้นมันอยู่ในคีย์อะไรนะครับเราอาจจะใช้ตั้งคำถามวันนี้ให้กับเด็กๆได้คุณครูก็ควรจะรู้ด้วยนะครับ นะฮะเพราะฉะนั้นการมีโน้ตอยู่ในนั้นโน้ตหลักๆ 4-5 ตัวเนี่ยนำมาถามให้เด็กรู้จักคิดว่ามันอยู่ในบันไดเสียงไหนเขาจะได้รีเลทกับคีย์นะครับแทนที่จะอ่านเป็นประเภทโน้ตต่อโน้ตต่อโน้ตตัวต่อตัวนี่มันจะจับความสัมพันธ์ไม่ได้นะครับอันนี้คือสิ่งที่เกิดขึ้นในการหาคีย์ไม่เจอนั้นใช้สเกลกับ broken chord เป็นตัวช่วยครับอาจารย์ยกตัวอย่างว่า melodic pattern มาจากสเกลอาจารย์จะพูดถึง rhythmic pattern ว่าสำคัญมากยกตัวอย่างจาก Great Christmas Carol บางทีเนี่ยโน้ตถูกแต่จังหวะไม่ถูกจับอะไรไม่ได้เลยนะครับแต่ถ้าบางทีไม่มีโน้ตแต่มีแค่ pattern จังหวะเราก็พอเดาได้อย่างเพลง Silent Night เพราะฉะนั้นเนี่ยอาจารย์เน้นว่า rhythmic pattern เนี่ยบางทีสำคัญมากกว่าตัวโน้ตอีกด้วยซ้ำไปมันจะทำให้เพลงนี้ฟังรู้เรื่องนะครับแล้วก็เป็นปัญหาเดียวกับการสอบเจอบ่อยๆว่าเล่นโน้ตถูกแต่จังหวะฟังไม่รู้เรื่องเลยจังหวะฟังไม่รู้เรื่องก็เหมือนเราพูดกันไม่รู้เรื่องมันเว้นวรรคผิดไปหมดนะครับอาจารย์จะพูดถึงตัว rhythmic pattern ต่อไปครับ
Now, it is perfectly possible to teach good rhythm. You can teach rhythm. And of course you can teach good sense of key, good sense of melodic shaping. But these two things need separate attention in your lessons. You will not encourage somebody to become a good sight reader just by giving them lots of sight reading tests, because there's too much information on the page for them to understand. So once they are beginning to understand time signatures, key signatures, and being able to understand rhythms, melodic shapes, then yes, the process is definitely eased by you giving them lots of examples. But initially, when you start this process, I think it's better to split it into rhythm, key, melodic shapes. And of course, at the root of a rhythmic pattern is time signature. And this is something which is covered slightly, of course, in the oral tests for the first 3 grades. The very first test they have to do is to clap in time as the examiner is playing, to join in as soon as they can, and to give a nice loud clap on the stronger beats. And I quite often find that candidates do quite a good job of that, but then give the wrong time. So they'll clap very ably in 3, and then I'll ask them was it in 2 time or 3 time, and they'll say it was in 2, which means they haven't really fully absorbed what it is they're doing. So make sure, again, you really integrate that. Okay, the rhythmic detail within a piece is very much related to the time signature of that piece. You can't really disentangle the 2 things. Okay? So in the same way as a melodic shape is related to the key signature, a rhythmic shape is related to the time signature. I'm sure you all know this. I'm not assuming you do not know this, but I want you to be really sure in your mind that you are going to help your pupils to understand sight reading better by splitting down the components into that way. That's why the Associated Board has oral tests, has sight reading, and not just 3 pieces. Because we want the full rounded musician who understands how music works. Yeah? Not just I can play fast on the piano or I can play beautifully on the piano. Okay? So rhythmic patterns, just to finish that little point, really are very important, and keeping them within a steady pulse is a really important thing. When I say pulse, I mean a beat, really. Okay? If the tempo is changing all the time, then it makes it very difficult to understand the rhythm, doesn't it? I'm sure you all agree. The 2 things are very much linked together. So make sure they have an instinctive understanding of rhythms. Get them to clap the rhythms of a sight reading test. If you just put 3 or 4 bars of music in front of them for grade 1, and get them to clap the rhythm. But before you do, get them to choose a speed in which they're going to do that. Okay? The rhythm and the tempo need to be glued together in a very tangible way. So once they really understand how they can use rhythms in this way, their sight reading will improve. And you'll quite quickly find that sight reading enables them to play their pieces better, and playing their pieces enables them to sight read better. The two things thread together in a very meaningful way. And a lot of grade 1, 2 and 3 piano players can sight read music which is nearly the same level of difficulty as the pieces they are playing. Because their sight reading is very good, and they're able to really get to grips with new pieces very, very quickly. Just imagine how lovely that is from a teacher's point of view, being able to do that, you know, rather than having to wait a month, 2 months for them to learn the right hand notes and the left hand notes, which is a little bit dull for you, isn't it, as a teacher? That's not particularly exciting teaching for you. I've done a lot of teaching myself, and I personally find teaching most interesting when I have somebody who's able to engage with the music fairly quickly. If they're taking a long, long time to get to grips with the rhythm or with the melody or the key, then this becomes a slightly more, you know, trying subject, both for us and for our students. We want them to enjoy this process, so help them to enjoy it by that way. So, rhythmic games, again flashcards. You can have cards with crotchets, quavers, minims, semi-breves. You can put them in a little row on the table and get them to clap different rhythms. Don't forget to try different tempos for these things. So let's say we have crotchet, quaver, quaver, minim. We have as a sequence. Now that is still crotchet, quaver, quaver, minim, even if I go or. So try to confirm that they really understand that by doing it at different speeds. Okay? Often in exams, pupils tell me that when I'm changing the rhythm, for example, in the C test of grades 1, 2 and 3, they will say you played a slower note or a faster note. And really what they're getting at is a change of rhythm, of course. And for every slower note, there will always have to be a faster note. So it demonstrates not a completely clear understanding of how rhythm works within a particular tempo. We're going to give you a demonstration of a sight reading test. It's a grade 1 piano test, and I think it's about time you heard something.
Professor Tanner, while we adjust the volume, just translate something. เดี๋ยวสรุปเรื่อง rhythmic pattern นิดนึงนะครับ rhythmic pattern ต่างกับ melodic pattern ตรงไหนต่างกันตรงที่ว่าเด็กๆจะต้องดูค่าโน้ตจังหวะให้ได้นะครับอาจารย์ให้ความสำคัญว่าบางทีสำคัญมากกว่าเพลงมากกว่าตัวโน้ตอีกด้วยซ้ำนะครับการทำ sight reading ไม่จำเป็นต้องให้เยอะเกินไปนะครับให้ทำทีละเพลงให้ดีๆการทำดี1เพลงจะทำให้เขาเล่นเพลงต่อไปได้ดีไม่ใช่เอาจำนวนปริมาณมาสัก20เพลงให้เด็กไปแล้วก็เล่นผิดๆถูกๆอย่างนั้นไม่ดีนะครับเอา1เพลงไปศึกษาไปให้ดีก่อนสำคัญมากตอนเริ่มต้นหัดนะครับตอนเริ่มต้นหัดเนี่ยเด็กต้องดู3ส่วนดูอันนี้อาจารย์เน้น rhythm เอา rhythmic pattern ขึ้นมาก่อนตามด้วย key signature แล้วก็จบด้วย melodic pattern นะครับถ้าเราจะเน้นเรื่อง rhythmic ก็จัดการเรื่อง rhythmic ก่อน rhythmic ให้มีความสัมพันธ์กับ time signature เพราะฉะนั้นถ้าเด็กไม่มีความสัมพันธ์ของ time signature กับ rhythm เด็กก็จะจับ pattern จังหวะไม่ได้ง่ายที่สุดก็คือจังหวะ3หรือจังหวะ2ถ้าเด็กไม่ relate ไม่ feel นะครับก็ไม่สามารถที่จะเข้าใจ rhythmic pattern ได้เช่นตบมือถูกในเทส 1A แต่ตอบจังหวะออกมาผิด feel ถูกแต่ตอบผิดอันนี้ก็ไม่ relate นะครับต้องให้เด็กมีความสัมพันธ์กันด้วยเพราะฉะนั้นสรุปเรื่อง melodic shape melodic ของโน้ตตามมาจาก scale นะครับ rhythmic pattern มาจากเรื่องของ time signature 2เรื่องนี้เป็นสิ่งสำคัญนะครับจากนั้นทั้ง2ส่วนนี้เอามาผสมกันต้องมี steady pulse ไม่ใช่เล่นเร็วๆช้าๆช้าๆเร็วๆเราจะจับจังหวะไม่ได้งั้น pulse ที่สำคัญให้ steady ให้นิ่งนะครับอาจารย์ยกตัวอย่างให้ฟังด้วยว่าให้ตบมือก่อนเอาโน้ตมาตบมือจากจังหวะเปลี่ยนให้จังหวะเร็วขึ้นหรือช้าลงหรือเปลี่ยนค่าโน้ตตบตัวดำหรือตบสเปนชั้นต่างๆก็จะเป็นตัวช่วยได้นะครับเกรด1ถึงเกรด3 sight reading ความยากไม่ได้ต่างกันมากเพราะฉะนั้นให้เด็กฝึกทำได้แล้วก็ที่สิ่งสำคัญนะครับให้สนุกกับการทำให้ enjoy นะครับอย่าทำให้มีความรู้สึกว่าฉันไม่ชอบเลยครูก็น่าเบื่อนักเรียนก็ทำตามไปนะครับพยายามให้เด็กมีความรู้สึกอยากทำงั้นคุณครูต้องเปลี่ยนแปลงนิดนึงก่อนนะครับคุณครูต้องอยากทำด้วยแล้วก็ใช้เครื่องมือต่างๆมี pattern note มีจังหวะนะครับคือเป็นอย่างเช่น flash card ต่างๆคอยประกบไว้เสมอก็จะช่วยได้ครับผม
Okay. Now I have two examples of candidates in a mock exam doing sight reading. The first one is a grade 1 piano, and the next one is doing a brass instrument sight read. Now, in neither case are they real tests. The ones from the specimen books, which I think are on sale here, and are a very useful experience for them to be practicing with. You don't have a copy of the music that this girl is going to play for you now, but that doesn't matter, because I want you to make an assessment. I want you to imagine that you are not a teacher, but you are an examiner, and you are listening to this, and I want you to try and weigh up in your mind whether there is a clear sense of rhythm and a clear sense of melody. You don't know what the melody is, you don't know what the rhythm is, but can you detect a sense of either of those things in this performance? That's the question you need to ask yourself, because that's the question the examiner is asking themselves.
จะให้ลองนะครับสมมติเราเป็น examiner เราไม่เห็นเพลงอยู่ข้างหน้าเรารู้ว่าเด็กที่เล่นในเทสเนี่ยเมโลดิกได้ไหมกับริทึมิกได้หรือเปล่าแล้วเราจะให้คะแนนได้ยังไงครับ
I'm going to replay that because I think it's quite important that you hear the little bit of dialogue at the beginning. Okay. Sorry, we seem to have a little technical difficulty here. Anyway, despite that, now, did any of you, would you like to put your hands up if you could feel a pulse there? Could you feel a rhythmic pulse, even if it's a slow one? Could you just put your hand up? No? Did any of you feel a sense of a melody coming through, even though you may have had one or two mistakes and so on? Did any of you detect a melody? Could I get you to sing the melody? No? No? No hands going up? Yeah. So, does this sound like it's potentially a very strong sight reading test then? Probably not. This is the sort of official response, if you like. This is what the examiner, that was John Holmes, incidentally, the chief examiner who was administrating that exam. This is the definitive comment. So this is the sort of comment that you would expect to read in response to that attempt. which I'm sorry to say was not very clear to you as of the video. Anyway, a hesitant reading which showed difficulties with note finding and time values. Okay? And the marks are out of 21. 14 is the pass for that, and the mark that would have been given was a 12, so that, in other words, fails the sight reading by a couple of marks. Okay? Now, if you just think about that comment again, a hesitant reading which showed difficulties with note finding and time values. Now, those are the main fundamentals, aren't they? If a candidate is having problems with finding the notes and the rhythms, then it's quite clear that it's not going to be heading in a very positive direction. One of the things that's really important, and I'm sure you know this already, but it's worth saying it again, and it's worth you reinforcing it at every opportunity when you're teaching, is this sense of continuity and connecting together all note values. That was what I call a note-by-note performance. In other words, there was no real logical connection between any of the notes. Okay? So even though some of the notes, I'm sure, would have been correct, there was no link between them, and therefore the outline of the music was not in place. Therefore it cannot pass. Okay? So that is quite typical, I have to say, of sight reading that I hear, not in Thailand, but in the world, in England as well. And it happens when there isn't a solid understanding of what is going on in terms of pitch and rhythm, and because they have not done enough practice with you in the context of your lesson. Okay? So, keeping going at all costs is a really important thing for them to do, and making sure that they have an understanding of all of the technical aspects of the sight reading is important too. I draw your attention to the syllabus, which you all have a copy of. I wonder how many of you are aware of the fact, if you look in your syllabus at the bottom of each page, when it talks about grades 1 to grade 8.
ให้ดูที่ข้างล่างสุดแต่ละเกรดสอนแต่ละเกรดจะมีฟุตโน้ตข้างล่างนะครับบอกดูเขาเขียนอะไรไว้ครับแต่ละหน้า
It's quite specific about what is required in terms of sight reading. So for grade 1 piano, a 4-bar piece in 4/4 or 3/4, or a 6-bar piece in 2/4 in C, G, F major, A minor or D minor, with each hand playing separately and in a 5-finger position. Simple dynamics, note values, articulations and occasional accidentals in minor keys only may be encountered. Now that's actually very specific help that it's giving you, isn't it? So there really is no excuse for a candidate coming out of an exam saying, it was in a horrible key, it was in a horrible time signature, because you as teachers are given the information about what that's going to be. Now let's jump to grade 8. Sight reading. Again, about the same sort of length of description, but now of course it's much more complicated. A piece of around a page in length, some of them are a little bit shorter than a page actually, but about a page in length, time and signatures as for grade 7, with the addition of 12/8 and B and D flat majors, 3-part chords in either hand, spread chords, and simple ornaments may be encountered. So again, very specific assistance to you. And what you'll find is that there is a correlation between the keys that they are learning for scales and arpeggios, the keys in which the pieces themselves are in, and the keys in which the sight reading will be in. There is a connection So, for example, in grade 3 piano, there's an A major hands together scale. So it would be reasonable, wouldn't it, to have a piece of music within their book, which is also in A major. And it's not impossible that they will encounter A major in a sight reading test as well. Okay? So again, the board is trying to connect together. It's trying to help you to help your pupils by joining up all of these things. So when you're looking through your syllabus, don't just use it to find out what the scales and arpeggios are and to choose the pieces and then close the book forevermore. Use it. There's lots of information in here, actually, that can be of real use to you. One of the things that was mentioned in the grade 1 was that it was in one hand position. I'm just wondering if everybody understands what that means. One hand position. Yeah. So, for example, this is one hand position. My hand is not moving up there. There's no need for me to pass the thumb up there, for example. It's all in one hand position. Okay? So, in other words, might be a melody that you could encounter for a sight reading test. Just make those up. They're not really sight reading tests, but that's an example of what you might in fact. And the left hand might be doing something like this. Again, in one hand position. So that's a technical bit of help there. Okay? So a lot of information is given to you in the syllabus about sight reading. So use it to your advantage. If you're a string player, you'll find it talks about positions. Yes? So I'm not going to go in great length here, but you will encounter other little bits of instruction such as sight reading. This is grade 4 viola. Don't need to open the book. A piece of around 8 bars in length. Time and signatures as for grade 3, with the addition of 6, 8 and A major. Shifts between first and third positions may be encountered. So again, that may mean something to you if you happen to be a viola teacher, and you should be incorporating that in your teaching. Okay? So we listened to one example of a sight reading test, which was a good effort, but probably not a successful outcome for that particular candidate, or at least within the context of that exam. Now let's look at preparation and internalisation. Preparation, I think we all know what preparation is. It's part of a process that you help your pupils with by being a good teacher, and it's part of the process that your pupils have to take a part in. They have to prepare themselves just as you have to prepare them. Internalisation might be a slightly more difficult word for you, and it's to do with how the inner ear makes sense of music without actually having to hear it out loud. Okay? And this is a really important thing for people to be able to do. In other words, if they can look at the score in a sight reading test and they have a sense of the shape of the notes, a sense of the rhythm, a sense of perhaps the character of the piece as well, and how the dynamics and the articulation and perhaps even the ornaments at the higher levels all come together in that piece, in their heads, then there's a better chance of it coming out for real in the performance situation. Now, internalisation is actually a very sophisticated thing, and I would encourage you not to spend too much time on internalisation for the first 3 grades. Quite often I find that candidates do not touch the piano at all during the 30 seconds of preparation time, which is a little frustrating. And they're looking at the music and they're trying to internalise, but they don't even know where the first note is, perhaps, when I then come to say to them, okay, it's time to hear you play your piece from the beginning now. So you could argue that was not at their 30 seconds. The examiner will always say to the candidate, you may practice out loud any part of this test before I ask you to play it. Okay? Surprisingly high percentage of people do not do that, even at grade 8. And believe me when I tell you that the examiner is not marking their preparation. We are not marking that. Okay? I swear to you, I promise you, this is true. So if they practice and they play it terribly, and then in the performance they play it beautifully, that's what they're being marked on. Okay? I promise you that's true. And also in the quick studies for the diplomas, if you ever have people doing that, in the 5 minutes of preparation, the examiners are not listening. Anything can happen, you know. It's what happens when the examiner says, okay, now play it. That's when they're being assessed, not the preparation. So make sure they understand how to use their 30 seconds profitably. At the higher level, 6, 7 and 8, internalisation, the business of hearing it, becomes even more important actually, because there's so much information on that page that 30 seconds is hardly long enough to compute these bits of information. Okay? But they still need to get a sense of how it feels to be playing that piece, I think. So encourage them to be using the keyboard or the violin or their voice as much as possible in the preparation of that sight reading. Okay? Important though internalisation is. Another thing you can do is talk about the music. Talking about the music is really important because in your lessons, this is how you can understand what the pupils understand and what they don't understand. For grade 6, 7 and 8 on piano, all of the sight reading tests have a name. For the first 5 grades, they're just called number 2B or 5C or whatever. For 6, 7 and 8, they might have a name. I'll make one up for you. The astronaut, or the deep sea diver, or something, okay? Neither of them, those are my made up names, but there are names which encourage, hopefully, at these higher levels, the candidates to have a sense of the character of the piece, okay? So this may be of assistance to them, but it will only be of assistance to them if you as teachers encourage them to have a discussion with you about names of pieces. I always find it very unusual that young musicians often don't know the name of the piece they're playing, even for the 3 pieces in the examination. I've heard candidates come in England, where there's no language issue at all, saying, I'm going to play a piece by Allegro, and it's called Beethoven. And they have absolutely no idea what the piece is, what it actually means. So this limits their prospects for really getting to the core character of the piece. Okay? So understanding the detail as it's written in, having a discussion about time signature, key signature, the rhythmic components, the little bits of scales, the arpeggios, all of those things in the lessons is a really good thing. And one thing that we can do as well is to have a running commentary. Get them to talk to you about what they are thinking and what they are understanding from the sight reading. So you put an example in front of them and say, tell me straight away, in a few seconds, what this piece is. They should be able to say, it's in G major, it's in 3/4 time, it's mostly crotchets and quavers, there are 1 or 2 minims, it starts on a G, finishes on a G, and it says slowly at the beginning. So it's a slow, calm piece. It has P written at the beginning, which means it's quiet, and therefore it's probably a soft, gentle, calm, tranquil piece. Okay, if they've got all of that in their head in the 30 seconds, and they know where the starting note for each and is, particularly for these single hand position examples, then they are well on the way to being able to do a good sight reading test. So have a discussion with them. What key is this piece in? Now they should know the keys because they're doing the scales and arpeggios for those same keys. You're not going to find 5 flats in a sight reading test for grade 2 piano because they're not introduced to that key yet. So it's a fair assumption that it's going to be in the keys they already know because you have taught them for the scales and arpeggios. Okay? And the same goes for time signatures and for rhythms. They will not encounter a strange rhythm, a strange triplet or something for grade 1, because it's not part of the musical language which we expect them to know about at that level.
Thank you. พูดยาวเลยนะครับย้อนกลับไปเรื่อง rhythmic pattern นิดนึง rhythmic pattern เนี่ยก่อนที่จะเข้าเรื่อง internalization นะครับ a sense of continuity ก็คือการให้ดนตรีต่อเนื่องเป็นสิ่งสำคัญมากอาจารย์เน้นนะครับตัวอย่างที่เราเห็นเด็กเล่นโน้ตเกือบถูกแต่จับจังหวะแทบไม่ได้เพราะฉะนั้นตัวอย่างเมื่อกี้นี้ตกนะครับก็คือ fail sight reading เต็ม21คะแนนที่เราให้กับเด็กคนเมื่อกี้นี้เท่าไหร่ครับจาก official ก็คือให้12ก็คือตกนะครับเพราะ14ผ่านคอมเมนต์ที่อาจารย์ให้อาจารย์พูด2ครั้งนะครับถ้าเล่นแบบนี้จะได้คำว่า hesitant reading อ่านตะกุกตะกักลังเลเพราะฉะนั้นถูกจัดการก่อนในเรื่องความลังเลนะครับแล้วก็มีความ difficulty in reading in note finding กับ time value หาโน้ตก็ไม่ค่อยจะถูกจังหวะก็จับไม่ค่อยจะได้เพราะฉะนั้นก็ไม่ได้นะครับเพราะฉะนั้นเด็กๆก็คงไม่สามารถที่จะผ่านการเทสกันขนาดอยู่ใน one hand position นะครับเมื่อกี้ที่ขอไปใน one hand เนี่ยก็คือในเปียโนเราก็คือโดเรมีฟาซอลไม่ได้มีการจับนิ้วไม่มีการ move ไม่มีการหมุนมือไม่มีการข้ามดังนั้นในช่วงเกรดหนึ่งเล็กๆเนี่ยมักจะอยู่แค่ one hand position เท่านั้นเองนะครับในวิโอลาต่างๆก็ในหนังสือจะบอกว่า shift position แค่ไหนนะครับแล้วให้ศึกษาจากใน syllabus ด้วยจากนั้นมาเรื่องการเตรียมตัวและ internalization นะครับอันนี้อาจารย์เน้นว่าในเด็กเล็กไม่ค่อยสำคัญเท่าไหร่ขอให้เป็นเด็กโตขึ้นไป internalization คือการเห็นดนตรีเห็นมองโน้ตปุ๊บเราเห็นภาพในหัวก่อนเลยว่าจับให้เร็วที่สุดว่าในเพลงนั้นมีอะไรให้มองได้ทุกอย่างครับจังหวะเป็นยังไงโน้ตเป็นยังไงโน้ตขึ้นลงแค่ไหนชาร์ปกันเป็นอย่างไรพยายามให้เด็กมีภาพในหัวก่อนที่จะเริ่มต้นเล่นนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นก่อนที่จะเริ่มต้นให้เห็นตรงนี้ให้ได้พอสมควร sense of note sense of pattern sense of dynamics in their heads ครับแต่ว่าไม่จำเป็นสำหรับเด็กเล็กมากเพราะมันจะยากเกินไปเด็กเล็กๆแค่มองตำแหน่งมองคีย์ว่าอยู่ตรงไหนแล้วก็เล่นออกไปนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นตรงนี้เป็นสิ่งสำคัญสำหรับเด็กเรียนโตขึ้นไปแล้วก็ 6-8 ขึ้นไปให้เด็กพูดคุยกับเราว่าให้เห็นโน้ตปุ๊บพูดออกมาเลยเห็นอะไรบ้าง talking about music นะครับอันนี้สำคัญทำให้เด็กได้คาแรคเตอร์ของเพลงก่อนเพราะฉะนั้นบางทีเราเน้นแต่ว่าให้เล่นแต่โน้ตเลยให้เขามี internalization ในหัวสมองเขาเห็นภาพรวมก่อนแล้วจะได้เล่นได้ดีขึ้นนะครับอันนี้คือสิ่งที่อาจารย์พูดถึงแล้วก็คุยกับเขาเลยใน lesson นะครับไม่ต้องไปรอให้กลับไปหาที่บ้านแล้วก็มาส่งเราอันนั้นไม่เวิร์กแน่นอนครับ
Thank you. And the last one on that list is observing dynamic markings and other marks of expression and articulation. I'm sure by now you realise that these are the sorts of details which are at the higher end of the mark scheme, as it were. Those things are not particularly important in terms of just establishing a pass at sight reading. Nobody's going to fail a sight reading because they ignored a forte or a piano or a staccato. They're going to fail the sight reading because they've not understood the key signature, the time signature, because it stops and starts far too often, because there isn't a sense of the outline coming forward. Okay? For those reasons. So those things are very nice to see in a performance, observing all those details, but we'll come on to those details in a little while. The next thing you're going to hear is a brass sight reading. Okay, that's working. That's working. Okay, there's nothing actually happening at the moment. The boy is just looking at the music during his 30 seconds preparation. This is grade 5, and he's obviously doing quite a lot of internal work here. Okay, now, that sounded like a piece of music to me. It didn't sound like a thoroughly polished performance, but it had a sense of key, it had a sense of rhythm, and it had a sense of continuity. Okay? Now, that particular student, you may have noticed, was ghosting. You know, he wasn't actually playing out loud during that time. But he clearly was able to do this internalising quite well, because that was quite clearly a competent performance, do not think. And in fact, that would have got something like 18 out of 21 for its performance. And here's the definitive comment. A rhythmical reading at a well-chosen speed. The key was not entirely secure, but some dynamic awareness came across. You wouldn't have been able to tell the dynamic variance because of the quality of the video there. But there was, the fundamental parts of the performance were in place, and I think that's really important. And because there was a sense of the dynamics, and there was a sense of articulation, this all led to the examiner being able to give a nice high mark. Okay? Even at grade 1 piano, there are dynamic markings. Not many of them, but they are there. And really, for a candidate to be getting something like 20 or 21 for the sight reading, they really need to be getting those details. And quite often, you'll get the right notes, the right rhythm, a steady pulse, but with no dynamics. Well, that limits the marks. They're automatically going to lose a couple of marks by not doing that. Most of them will know what piano, what F mean, that forte, they will know what a crescendo is because they are encountering those things in their pieces. So if they have time in their brain to still think about those, get them to incorporate those, they're not just superficial details, they add up to a really polished performance. I would love to be able to give more 21 out of 21s for sight reading. It's very rare that we do that. It's very rare we give full marks for anything, of course. But I think the sight reading is one of those things, if you teach it very well, you should be able to get a higher percentage of your students into that 19, 20, or even 21 bracket. So that's a really important thing for you to be thinking about. Let's have a little look at this simultaneous learning slide that I have up here. Making connections with the pieces, I think we've talked about that now. Connecting a particular piece being learnt with a sight reading exercise via a rhythm or key. Yes, we've talked about that as well. Okay, so if they're playing a piece in 6/8, make sure that they are familiar with the components of 6/8. In fact, there are 2 beats and a bar split into 3 quavers or a dotted quaver, a semi-quaver and a quaver, or whatever the rhythmic pattern might be, so that they are familiar with going yum, bum, 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 bum. And then if they encounter this in a sight reading test, it's not a completely foreign thing for them, it's not completely strange. Okay? So rhythm, setting a pulse, and playing rhythm games are all things that you can do to really increase the chances of all of those things coming together. Simultaneous learning is something I've talked about already in lots of different ways. All it means is tying up the learning of the pieces with the learning of the scales, with the learning of the sight reading and the oral, so that the whole thing becomes one continual process of understanding how music is notated on paper and how it sounds when they actually produce it on their instrument. Okay? So, the theory, 6/8 in 2 beats and a bar, and so on. G major, it's got 1 sharp, etc. Writing down the simple patterns that you can expect to find within a time signature, comparing those patterns and even getting them to play those patterns, to clap them and to play them, so that they really get thoroughly aware of what those mean. As I say already, in the oral tests, we already do that. We get them to sing echoes, which have rhythms, and we get them to clap the pulse. For grade 4 and 5, we also, of course, then start introducing clapping the rhythm, not just the pulse, but the rhythm of the piece, or a section of the piece. So again, that's integrated with understanding how rhythms play a part in the musical meaning of a piece of music. Improvisation. Why not get your pupils to improvise in a particular key, or in a particular time signature, or with a particular rhythmic idea? So, for example, you could give them something like this. And you just give them that as a starting point. Makes sense. I'm not saying it was the most inventive melody ever created, but it made sense as a structure. It went somewhere and it came back to the original starting note, and there was a sense of it being a melody that made sense. And it's that kind of thing that you can help them to do. If they're automatically thinking in a logical way about how rhythms and notes may connect together, then they will not be taken by surprise when they find that sort of thing in the context of their actual sight reading test. Oral, hearing the piece internally, again, I think we've already covered that. As the exam approaches, talking about the piece, I think I mentioned that before, getting them to give you a running commentary about the piece, put it in front of them and say, right, tell me some information. You haven't got 5 minutes to think about it. Tell me straight away. It's got 4 flats. It's in F minor. It's in 7/8. Rhythmic components are 1 2 3 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 1 2 3 4. The mood of the piece is so and so. Okay, because the title is The Witch on a Broomstick or something. Okay. And the piece is mostly loud, there are lots of staccatos. Get them to talk in those sorts of ways about the music, okay? And then there's a chance that this will all come through in what they actually do. Would you like to? I've given you rather a lot to say.
That's fine. Thank you.
Aware of that.
สรุปไปเรื่องย้อนไปเรื่องตั้งแต่ตัวอย่างของไซด์รีดดิ้งของเครื่อง brass นะครับ brass นั้นได้คะแนนดีไหมครับได้คะแนนดีมากเพราะเด็กคนนั้นนั่นเกรด 5 นะครับมีภาพของดนตรีอยู่ในใจอาจารย์พูดถึงเรื่อง internalization ตัวอย่างนั้นก็คือการเห็นว่าเด็กเนี่ยเห็นภาพ grasp idea ได้พอสมควรแล้วก็เล่นออกมาได้นะครับคอมเมนต์ก็จะมีลักษณะ well chosen tempo เป็นจังหวะที่ดี เล่นจังหวะได้ดีนะครับแล้วก็รู้จักคีย์พอสมควรนะครับแล้วก็มี fundamental เรื่องรายละเอียดต่างๆของ articulation คือดังเสียงสั้นเสียงยาว dynamics ดังเบาต่างๆก็เลยเน้นว่าถ้าจะได้คะแนนในระดับที่เกือบจะได้ distinction เนี่ยนะครับก็จะต้องมีครบทุกอย่างในเด็กเล็กเนี่ยเกรด 1-3 อ่านโน้ตถูกจังหวะได้แต่ลืมใส่รายละเอียดนะครับก็จะไม่ได้คะแนนเต็มยากมากที่จะได้21เต็ม21นะครับอย่างมากถ้าเล่นได้ถูกหมดหายรายละเอียดในเรื่องของดังเบาซึ่งส่วนใหญ่มีตั้งแต่เกรด 1เลยนะครับก็จะนับประมาณได้19ได้20แต่ไม่ได้ถึง21นะครับเพราะฉะนั้นอย่าลืมเรื่องรายละเอียดด้วยหลังจากที่ได้โน้ตจังหวะแล้วนะครับตอนนี้มาเรื่องต่อไปที่อาจารย์พูดก็คือการฝึกให้มี simultaneous learning simultaneous ก็คือการเกิดขึ้นไปพร้อมๆกันกับบทเรียนเช่นให้โน้ต sight reading ปุ๊บให้เด็กเริ่มดูพูดอะไรออกมาก็ได้ให้เขามองแล้วพูดนะครับตรงนี้เป็นไอเดียที่เราละเลยกันไปที่เราเน้นแต่เรื่องโน้ตอะไรจังหวะอะไรใช่ไหมครับให้เขามองภาพรวมก่อนมองภาพรวมไม่ได้แล้วพูดคุยกับเราในห้องใน lesson เลยจะได้ฝึกตรงนี้ได้นะครับใช้ความรู้ที่เขามีคีย์ต่างๆที่เรียนในสเกลในเกรดนั้นๆเกรด 1-3 มีสเกลอะไรก็ไม่เกินนั้นหรอกครับไม่ใช่ว่าเกรด 1จะมี5 flag มาใน sight reading เป็นไปไม่ได้ใช่ไหมครับดูว่า theory คร่าวๆเป็นยังไง key signature เป็นยังไง melodic pattern เป็นอย่างไรตบมือเอาแต่ทำนองออกมานะครับหรือตบจังหวะแยกให้ดีนะครับตบจังหวะหรือตบทำนองแล้วก็ฝึก improvisation ให้ลองแต่งเอาโน้ตตัวแรกมาเปลี่ยนไปเปลี่ยนมาไม่ต้อง inventive มากไม่ต้องโอ้โหแฟนซีมากเอาแค่ให้มัน make sense นะครับพอสมควรที่จะไปได้อันนี้ก็เป็นตัวอย่างต่างๆนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นอันนี้คือเมื่อเข้าห้องสอบสิ่งที่เราควรจะฝึกใน lesson ก็คือของต่างๆเหล่านี้ที่จะเป็นประโยชน์ Please.
Thank you. We're getting quite close to the end of this section now. In the lead up to the actual exam, as part of your sort of structure of learning sight reading or teaching them how to go about it, a good idea is to start with a longer period of time initially for them to be doing this internalization, practicing out loud and talking to you about what they're understanding in the score. You might want to give them anything up to a minute to start with. Certainly for the higher grades, I'd give them a minute. And then gradually reduce it to 45 seconds and then 30 seconds. Whether it's grade 8 or grade 1, they will always get 30 seconds. Okay? And the expectation is that a grade 8 player thinks in a grade 8 way. And therefore the music that they are required to assimilate in that 30 seconds is going to relate to that kind of brain. So of course there's a lot more on the page. You know, a grade 8 sight reader has got a whole page with lots of detail. A grade 1's only got 4, 5, 6 bars. But relative to their ability level and their musical experiences, it should be the same. Their ability should be the same to assimilate those. So whittle the time down in a structured way and see if you can get them to acquire all these important details of the music in a short time frame, because 30 seconds is such a short period of time. Many candidates say to me, 30 seconds. And I'll say to them, would you now play it? And they can't believe they've had 30 seconds, but practice it with them. 30 seconds is such a short period of time. Okay? We know that they would do quite a good job with that test if you gave them 5 minutes. Yeah? But that's not the test. The test is to see if they can do it in sight reading it. There isn't time to learn it, there's time to sight read it, and that's the really important point. And what does the examiner actually look for then? Well, look, I think I'm sure you've ascertained from what I've said so far exactly what they're looking for. A steady pulse is, for no small reason, at the top of that list. A steady pulse without hesitations is a crucial part of any performance. It's also true of the pieces they play, isn't it? A steady pulse. I'm not talking about rubato and having an accelerando or a ritardando within a piece. Of course, that's a separate issue. but assuming those things are not part of the actual construction of the piece, a steady pulse all the way through is what we're looking for. Okay? Observance of the key. Yeah? Accurate notes and rhythms, well, if they're observing the key, then they're going to be observing the notes within the key most of the time, aren't they? Yeah? If you say to them A flat major, it's got 4 flats there, then their fingers should be moving towards the D flat within the scale. If they're repeatedly playing D naturals, then they don't really understand A flat major, do they? And they're probably not going to understand it when they're playing the scale of A flat major either. So those two things are very linked up. Observance of markings. Well, that's the P's, the F's, the staccatos, the character of the piece. There is a speed at which a character of a piece no longer can exist. If you play something too slowly, then A, there is no sense of pulse, and B, there's no sense of character. You know, nothing influences character more than tempo. So sometimes you find that people play things so fast that the character is just as dislodged from the performance as if they play it too slowly, actually. So worth thinking about all of those things. And what we're really after is something that begins to sound like a piece of music. Yeah? Like the brass sight reading test that you had there. It sounded like a piece of music. So if it sounds like music to you, and it feels like music to the candidate, then the examiner is probably going to think it sounds quite musical as well. You don't have to do a huge amount to get 14 marks in sight reading, but you do have to do those things, you know. So make sure they understand that there are 21 marks available for this component of their exams, which is a substantial number. If their sight reading is terrible, they're not being marked out of 150 anymore, are they? They're being marked out of 29. Yeah? Because 21 marks have gone. Yeah? One occasionally, as an examiner, comes across pupils who say, I'm not doing any sight reading. I'm telling you now, I'm not going to do the sight reading. So, you know, as I say, in that particular case, there's 21 marks they've lost, effectively, you know. So it's really important that you take this seriously as a component of their musicianship and in the context of the exam. I'm aware of the fact that we're running out of time here, but just maybe a couple of questions about sight reading and then we'll stop for a few minutes. Does anyone have any particular questions about what examiners are looking for or how to prepare your pupils? I may have covered every detail. It's a hand.
I have one student. He plays fluently. He got like 140 distinction, but he never reads music. He usually uses his ears.
Yeah.
So and he's a music scholarship in his school.
What grade are we talking about here?
7.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I really don't know how to.
Yeah.
I just hope that he could improve his skills, so that would be much better.
Well, yeah, I mean, perhaps one of the problems is that he has managed, is it he or she, that he has managed to get to this level and get such high marks without doing it. And this seems to confirm to him that he doesn't need to bother. You know, I think the secret is to not let them get to that point, you know, to make sure that they understand the whole point of being able to read and to sight read right from prep test level, even though there isn't a component of sight reading in the prep test. That's the one element we don't deal with actually in the prep test at all. But from grade 1 it is. And I think it comes down to you and your priorities. I'm aware of the fact, I have taught for 20 years, I'm aware of students who are reluctant to get to grips with learning. I am familiar with this. But it's your job. That's one of your roles. If you're going to teach them sophisticated music from the Western art tradition, then you're going to have to teach them how to read, because it increasingly plays a role in their musical understanding. At diploma level, I've mentioned diplomas a couple of times now, at diploma level they have to be able to discuss quite a lot about their music, and they have to do a quick study which lasts, for which they have 5 minutes of preparation time. So it's not inconceivable, if you have a grade 7 student who's getting 140, it's not inconceivable that they might want to do a diploma in 5 years' time. And they're going to find that very difficult. They're not going to pass the quick study if you're not going to encourage them to get them into the sight reading. So I have no immediate answer for you. I cannot wave a magic wand. The best way of getting them to improve their sight reading is to persuade them that there is a need to do so, and that life becomes easier for them if they can. And it's only them that's missing out. If they can get 140 and they're failing the sight reading, then just, that means you have, quite a very able musician there who is being held back by this reading skill problem. So it's an extreme example of that. Most of us have, much more moderate pupils who still have that problem, still need to be encouraged to think about sight reading in that way. I'm going to stop now for 5 minutes, and then we're going to get back going again. You probably need a break from me just for a few minutes. Please don't go very far. I'll come back again in 5 minutes and we'll do the next component of this presentation.
โอเคนะครับเดี๋ยวอีก5 นาทีนะครับอย่าไปไหนไกลนะครับต้องแปลนะครับไม่ยิ่งคงไม่ต้องนะครับก็จบแล้วนะครับเป็นเรื่องต่างๆโอเคเดี๋ยว5 นาทีนะครับแล้วก็เดี๋ยวกลับมาในที่หลังครับ
Slide. We talked about technical aspects of things, and also about the rhythmic nature of something. The pulse, the time, the meter, and the accentuation is really important in terms of rhythmic control, just as we talked about technical control. Merit, pass, and distinction are all very different sort of levels of rhythmic control. In a piece like that, it's all about the rhythm, isn't it? The jauntiness of the music is so built up into the music that it's very clearly able, I'm sure you can immediately see how important the rhythmic component of that piece is. I'm going to play you now a flute piece. I think I can see which way that's heading, that video, so I'm going to sort of revise my thoughts a little bit, make it a bit more piano orientated. I talked a little bit about pedal just now. I mentioned that I should sort of fill you in about that. Pedal, a lot of pieces sound much better with pedal, even at grade 1, but they don't need in order for the examiner to be able to award a distinction. The difference between a piece at grade 5 and 6, 7 and 8 and a piece at grades 1, 2, 3 and 4 is that the pedal, if it's marked in and is needed for the character and spirit and style of the piece, must be in place. So we start expecting pedal to be used effectively at grade 5. It's the same sort of time at which vibrato is expected for a string player. That's, you sometimes hear vibrato at grade 1 on violin. Great, lovely. You sometimes hear pedal used really efficiently at grade 1 or 2 on piano. Great, lovely. And then that could influence the marks to some degree, as long as it's done nicely. But at grade 5 we actually expect it. So if it's supposed to be a moody piece with lots of atmosphere and their pedal is marked in and the candidate is not doing it, then that's a fundamental misunderstanding of that piece. They're packaging the piece in an inappropriate way. Similarly, if they use too much pedal and they make what's supposed to be a beautiful, clear, crisp, baroque piece into something which sounds more like Debussy, then that's an inappropriate use of pedal. So bear that in mind. Pedal is a nice part of the sound world of the piano, but we don't expect it to be in place. You will find some pedal markings in pieces grade 4 or 3, but they're not absolutely essential to what's being done. And therefore the examiner will not criticise the fact that your candidate did not use pedal. But at grade 5 and above, they will criticise. So if I'm hearing what's supposed to be a romantic piece, and I'm getting this kind of effect, then I will criticise it. The texture of that romantic piece, Consolation by Liszt, requires pedal. It just doesn't work without pedal. It just doesn't, you know? So obviously it would need something like this. So it becomes an integral part of the music. So good thing to bear in mind, because I've often been asked by people, you know, what happens about the pedal? How crucial is it? So now hopefully you have some understanding of what the pedal is there to do, where it's helpful and where it's absolutely essential. Okay? Done with that one. I can give you an example now of a piece at grade 5 level, which I would say does need pedal, but I'm not going to put the pedal in. Okay? So rather than, unlike the Liszt Consolation, which is obviously a more advanced piece, this is a little piece that involves pedal, but you're not going to get pedal. That's roughly grade 5 piece. It makes a degree of sense without pedal, but when you hear me play it in a minute with pedal as it was intended, and as the examiner has a perfect right to expect you to do, because it is a grade 5 piece, you'll see just how much it's transformed. It's adding another dimension to a piece and taking it beyond the notes. You could almost think it was a piece of Bach the first time without pedal. because there's very little shape and coherence to the kind of logic of the piece and how it's constructed. Okay? So it's that level of understanding and awareness of what's going on in terms of tonal control and in the pedal and how that can affect it at that sort of level. Control of musical detail, well, we've just started talking about that now. Distinction requires refined control. I think we all know refined control when we hear it. Refined control is where there is a degree of sophistication to the sound, elegance, a real sense of ownership in that piece, where the detail is so clearly sort of threaded into the performance that it sounds almost spontaneous. When I'm teaching my advanced students, I often say to them, your objective is to try to make it sound as though you wrote the piece. Not that you're playing the piece, but that you composed it, even if it's a piece of Beethoven or Bach. And if you can make it sound as though you composed it, then you've really got to the core meaning of that piece. Because it's not just that you're ticking boxes, you know, P in bar 6, forte in bar 17, ritardando between bar 22 and 23. You're not just following the rules, but you've absorbed all of this into your playing, so that it sounds spontaneous, it sounds as though you're composing the piece in front of our very eyes. You're not just ticking the boxes. Okay? Ticking the boxes for dynamics and for other expressive markings is more of a meritable sort of bit of play. Is there anything you want to do on that?
จริงๆอันนี้เหมือนเราฟังกันต่อไม่ได้นะครับอาจารย์เน้นตั้งแต่ผ่านมาก็คือมีเรื่องตั้งแต่ technical control นะครับ technical control ทุกอย่างมี3ระดับ distinction merit กับ pass นะครับ refine control ก็คือควบคุม good ก็คือปานกลาง merit นะครับแล้วก็จะ educate control ก็คือ pass ทุกอย่างอยู่ใน3 criteria ตัวนี้นะครับนั้นอาจารย์เริ่มจากเทคนิคก่อนถ้าเทคนิคไม่มีก็เหมือนกับเราไม่มีสื่อไม่มีคำไม่มีสื่อกลางที่จะ express ดนตรีได้เพราะฉะนั้นให้เน้นเรื่องเทคนิคก่อนนะครับแล้วก็ถ้าเล่นดีเนี่ยจะฟังเพลงเล็กๆเนี่ยอาจารย์ยกตัวอย่างจาก class merit distinction ถ้าเล่นดีปุ๊บเพลงเกรด 1อาจจะฟังเพลงเกรด 3นะครับถ้าเล่นไม่ดีก็เพลงเกรด 3อาจจะฟังเพลงเกรด 1นะครับในนั้นแล้วก็เรื่องต่อไปเป็น rhythmic control นะครับ rhythmic ที่อาจารย์ผ่านไปเลยเพราะว่าวิดีโอมันขึ้นไม่ได้ทุกคนควรจะรู้ว่าเล่นดีไม่ดีในเรื่องจังหวะเป็นอย่างไรอันนี้อาจารย์พูดถึง tonal control นะครับในเปียโนตั้งแต่เกรด 5 ขึ้นไปเนี่ยการใช้ pedal เป็นสิ่งที่ควรจะทำแต่ถ้าในตั้งแต่เกรด 1 ถึงเกรด 3 เนี่ยไม่จำเป็นแต่ถ้าทำได้ก็ดีแต่ถ้าไม่ทำอาจารย์ examiner จะไม่ criticize จะไม่วิจารณ์ตรงนั้นแต่ถ้าเกรด 5 ไปแล้วอาจารย์ยกตัวอย่างบางบทเพลงถ้าไม่เหยียบ pedal ปุ๊บจะฟังเพลงบาร์พอเหยียบ pedal ปุ๊บมันให้อารมณ์เด็กนะครับนั่นก็มีความจำเป็นครูต้องพิจารณาให้ดีว่าควรจะใช้หรือไม่นะครับนอกจากเพด a ลแล้วการสร้างโทนก็ยังมีเรื่องรูบาโตหรือวิบราโตของพวกไวโอลินต่างๆของพวกนี้ก็เป็นสิ่งที่เราควรจะพิจารณาด้วยครับแล้วก็มาถึงการคอนโทรลของมิวสิคอลดีเทลต่างๆตรงนี้ให้นึกถึงว่าเราเป็นคนประพันธ์เพลงไม่ใช่เราแค่นั่งเช็คว่าเพลงนี้มันควรจะทำยังไงนี่เหมือนกับเป็นทิกบ็อกซ์อย่างนั้นไม่ใช่นะครับให้คิดว่าเราเป็นคนแต่งเราต้องการอะไรในบทเพลงนี้จะช่วยให้เรามีคาแรคเตอร์สุดท้ายคือมิวสิคอลดีเทลได้ดี
Okay, so that's one of the fundamental differences between a grade 1, 2, 3 and 4 piece and a grade 5, this business of pedal. I hope you've all really understood that point and make sure that you, if you want to use your some pedal with your students at the lower grade, do your best to make sure it actually makes sense. But it's not absolutely indispensable in the piece. The music chosen for those grades will largely work without pedal. And we're not expecting pedal, nor will we criticise it if it doesn't. But at grade 5, 6, 7 and 8, if it's not got pedal and it needs it, you will lose marks, and that has to be the case. Because I'm sure you wouldn't want it to be any other way. If you have a student who uses the pedal well, you want the examiner to notice. You want the examiner to give marks for that. So obviously they're going to take marks away if it's not there. Yeah? I think this is a crucial thing. Talking about tempo and flexibility. This is something that I've often been asked about in England when I've been doing various talks with teachers and so on. Sometimes the examiner might say the pulse was not firmly rooted, or it was not a nice steady pulse. In other pieces they might say a little more flexibility would assist this piece. Now that might seem to you to be a slight contradiction. Does the examiner want it to be steady, or does he want it to be flexible? Make your mind up, examiner. Well, it depends on the piece, frankly. Okay? And there is a difference between somebody changing the tempo because they've made a conscious decision that the music benefits from this, and then changing the tempo because they cannot play at a steady speed. Okay? I'm going to give another example now. I've given up on the video. I'm going to give an example of a piece which needs a degree of freedom, a degree of rubato, but you're not going to get it. Okay? So I'm going to play musically, I'm going to put some dynamics in, I am going to use the pedal, but I'm not going to be very flexible with tempo, so that's the one thing I'm going to deprive you of. Otherwise it will be nice playing. And there was not much wrong with that piece, it moved along. I'm sure you can all 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, played the right notes, used the pedal quite nicely, connected the melody, brought out the balance between the hands quite well. But the music is supposed to be a lullaby, so it needs to have a certain sense of being more intimate, more expressive, and therefore just a little bit more free and flexible within the tempo. So this is now me trying to play it nicely, doing what I want to do with the piece. So, what I was applying there was a sense of my own creativity in the piece. So I'm thinking of the piece as a sort of ball of plasticine or clay, and I'm shaping it according to my own instincts. Only some of those markings, so some of those things I just did, were marked in. One or two ritordandos and things, but most of it was not written in. Most of it was instinctive. Now, it's much easier for you to play a piece as though you wrote it if you did write it, and I did write that piece, so obviously I'm in a better position to apply my own instincts to it than you would otherwise be. But actually a lot of the things that are in that piece you find in other romantic pieces. It's about applying a certain amount of disciplined flexibility to the performance, if I make myself clear. And so to get those sort of 28, 29 and the elusive 30 for a piece, you need that degree of communication so that the examiner doesn't really even want to write. They just want to sit and listen. Occasionally I get that, and it's a lovely experience from my point of view. I hear somebody playing with such communication and authority that I don't really want to have to write about it. I just want to sit there and think, oh, that's great. But my job is to write about it, so I write about it. So I could write it. This was a fantastic piece, and give it 29, and get on with listening to it, which is what I really want to do. And really, so it comes down to you as a teacher being able to help them to decide when a piece can afford to be flexible and when it needs to be a little bit more strict. And one of the things that you can do is to be able to demonstrate yourself in a musical way. It's not the case that all baroque music is a strict tempo, all classical music is a strict tempo. Romantic music, suddenly we get flexible. It's much more subtle than that. Bach needs to be flexible. You listen to a recording of people playing Bach on a modern piano, not on a harpsichord or an early key, clavichord or something, but on a modern piano, they will be playing flexibly. Yeah? And when you play Beethoven on a modern piano, you again need to be flexible in a different way. So being flexible in Rachmaninoff is not the same as being flexible in Scarlatti, but they both need flexibility. Here's a piece of Scarlatti for you that I'm going to play with no change in tempo. I'll just give you the first few bars. For my ear, that's crying out for a little bit of personality, a little bit of commitment, some ideas, some flexibility, to make it more than just notes. So, if I were to hear that in an exam situation, I would say it was efficient, it chose a nice speed, the lines came across clearly. It now needs a bit more of an injection of your own ideas, a bit more sense of involvement to bring the piece properly to life. Yeah? So something like this. Very much comes down to a question of taste. For some people that's too romantic, for other people it's not romantic enough. So we're not passing a value judgment on you as an examiner. We want it to be more romantic, or it was too stiff or whatever. It's more a case of whether you appear as a player to be communicating something of value in the music. Are you stamping your interpretation? If you play notes and rhythms accurately, that's not an interpretation. It's a computer MIDI file. It's not an interpretation, and therefore, although for grades 1 to 5, it will probably pass, more than a basic pass, because there's nothing there that's actually getting involved in the music. Okay? You'll find that in certain pieces for the first 5 grades, there are not many dynamic markings, not many tempo markings. This is not a reason for not doing it or discouraging your students from doing some dynamics. It's just a symptom of the sort of time period in which some of the music was written. As a composer myself, sometimes I put lots of dynamics in my markings, in my scores. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I think I'm just going to leave it to the person who's playing it. But in both cases, I want a sense of involvement. So don't confuse the fact that there's nothing on the page with the fact that we don't expect them to be doing something. So, occasionally we may say as an examiner, this piece needed a bit more flexibility, a bit more imagination with dynamics. You look at the score, and there's no dynamics written in. You think, what does he mean? There's nothing there. Well, yes, but there's something up here, surely. There's still heart and there's still brain activity going on. So you need to make some musical judgments about the style and the context in which you can be expressive. You really want to get that sort of distinction territory, refined control, refined elegance, and sense of real precision. We have reached that moment, about half an hour later than I hoped to, where questions could come forward if you want to, about anything really that we talked about today, preferably within the 2 subject levels, the pieces and the sight reading, but not necessarily.
Okay, just wrap up the last section. ครับเดี๋ยวสรุปคร่าวๆส่วนสุดท้ายนะครับอันนี้เป็นไอเดียที่ดีนะครับหวังว่าจะนำไปใช้จริงๆแล้วเราต้องเล่นดนตรีตามเหมือนที่เราเป็นคนแต่งถึงแม้ในสกอร์เด็กๆนะครับไม่ได้เขียนไดนามิกเราก็ไม่ทำเลยอันนั้นก็ไม่ถูกนะครับอันนี้ตัวของเราที่เป็นครูเนี่ยเราจะต้องตีความเพลงต้องให้ค่อนข้างจะมีความยืดหยุ่นในระดับที่ใช้ได้คราวนี้เนี่ยแต่ละคนก็จะมีมาตรฐานที่ต่างกันไปนะครับเราต้องวิเคราะห์เพลงดีๆว่าเพลงนี้ทำอะไรได้บ้างไหมอย่างเพลงที่อาจารย์เล่นเป็นสกาลาตี้เนี่ยบางคนตีความเป็นสตริงไม่มีการยืดหยุ่นกับอีกคนหนึ่งตีความเป็นโรแมนติกหน่อยไม่ผิดนะครับถ้าคนนั้นเล่นเป็นโรแมนติกแล้วเขาเหมาะสมกับบุคลิกภาพของเขาเพราะฉะนั้นการที่อาจารย์พูดว่าyou appear to be in the music as you like or as you want to be เนี่ยอันนี้สำคัญนะครับเราต้องเล่นดนตรีอย่างที่ตัวเราเป็นบางทีแต่ละคนเล่นไม่เหมือนกันไม่เป็นอะไรในสกอร์เขียนอย่างหนึ่งเราอาจจะเล่นแตกต่างมีความยืดหยุ่นได้บ้างหรือมีความสตริงได้บ้างอันนี้เป็น heart and brain นะครับเป็นการเล่นดนตรีด้วยหัวใจแล้วก็ด้วยสมองด้วยนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นเราเป็นครูเราไม่ใช่ว่าสตริงอย่างนี้ต้องแบบนี้เท่านั้นการเล่นบาร์ต้องตรงแบบนี้ถ้าเล่นบาร์ในสมัยก่อนเล่นในฮาร์ปซิคอร์ดเขียนตรงแต่ถ้าเล่นในโมเดิร์นเปียโนเราอาจจะยืดหยุ่นได้บ้างนะครับของเหล่านี้เป็นสไตล์เป็น awareness แล้วก็เป็นคล้ายๆกับ taste นะครับรสนิยมในการเล่นอันนี้ก็เป็นตัวอย่างที่ดีหวังว่าจะได้ประโยชน์นะครับแล้วก็มีคำถามส่วนไหนบ้างถามอาจารย์ได้เลยครับ
I had one little thing I wanted to mention, that's memory. I think there's a misunderstanding sometimes about the involvement of memory. We go along to a professional piano recital or a piano concerto, and quite often there's no music on the music stand. And we assume that this must therefore drip down into even grade 1 music exams. But it doesn't. There's no point at which memory is expected. And quite often I find that I would be able to give several marks more to a performance if they had used the score, because then memory slips would not have come in. So sometimes I think, well, if the piece stopped right now, I would give it 27. And then memory slips happen. In the last 3 bars, they go back, play a couple of bars again. It's now lost several marks straight away, just because of the memory. If they had the score there, they would have been able to rescue the situation. So memory is overstated. The importance of memory is overstated. It's one of those performance traditions as opposed to something which is absolutely essential. And even at diploma level, you do not need to be playing from memory. Just because Ashkenazi or Lang Lang plays from memory does not mean a grade 3 pianist needs to play from memory. And the other thing is that when they memorise, students do not always memorise all of the details. They remember the notes and the rhythms, but they don't remember the dynamics. So when you have a child who comes along for a lesson and plays a grade 3 piece to you from memory, nice and accurately, you might want to say to them, yes, but what's the articulation? The second time that phrase comes back, is it slur dot slur, or is it dot slur dot? And is it forte, or is it mezzo forte? Well, where does the ral come? Now, unless they can tell you that, they haven't memorised the piece. All they've memorised is the notes and the rhythms. So it could be the case that they are playing quite effectively from memory, and they're not having to look at the book, but they're missing lots of details as a result. So that's another reason for not having this preoccupation with playing everything from memory. Okay?
ครับจะลดคอระฆังคอควาย8313เพื่อเลื่อนลดนิดนึงนะครับโอเคครับอาจารย์พูดเรื่อง memory นะครับ memory ไม่ได้ expect ไม่จำเป็นต้องไม่เลยนะครับตั้งแต่เกรดจนถึงระดับดิโพลมาไม่จำเป็นต้องจำโน้ตครับเอาโน้ตเข้าไปได้แล้วการที่เล่นโน้ตจากความจำได้ perfect ไม่ได้มีคะแนนเพิ่มขึ้นนะครับแต่ถ้าเล่นโน้ตผิดและโน้ตหลุดมีผลต่อคะแนนนะครับเพราะฉะนั้นอันนี้ก็ไม่ได้เป็นการแสดง recycle เป็นการสอบช่วยเรื่อง memory slip จะได้ไม่เกิดปัญหาขึ้นนะครับแล้วก็การจำเนี่ยส่วนใหญ่แล้วเด็กจะจำแต่โน้ตแต่ไม่ได้จำดีเทลเสียงเพลงไม่ได้จำ articulation ตามเป้าต่างๆอันนี้ก็จะชัดเจนเวลาเล่นเพราะลิ้นทำเสียงดังเสียงเบาเพราะฉะนั้นไม่จำเป็นต้องจำนำโน้ตเข้าไปในข้อสอบได้นี่มีอะไรเพิ่มเติมไหมครับ
And just one final thing, and that's to do with repeats in pieces. Again, there seems to be a bit of a misconception about repeats. Basically, don't do repeats. Okay? Sometimes a piece is made up of lots of 4-bar phrases that have repeats in, and the music would not make sense without those repeats. So clearly they need to stay in place. And if there's a da capo, a DC, where the piece goes to the bottom of the page and then you have to go back to the beginning and then it stops after fine or something, that needs to be there as well because the structure of the piece would be completely ruined without it. But if there is a section of a piece that repeats just because the composer felt like repeating it, don't do it. Because there is a time in the exam. The exam time is a very difficult thing to stick to as an examiner. And there isn't time, we work on the assumption that the repeats will not be played. And certainly for grades 5, 6, 7 and 8, we just don't have time to sit there and listen to somebody play 2 or 3 minutes of extra music because we're thinking, gosh, we're going to be running late for the next candidate. So please try and think about that. I know it's nice in a real performance situation to do a repeat and maybe do forte the first time and piano the second time or something, but there just isn't, we do not have the luxury of that time in an exam. So if you can, there are plenty of grade 3, 4 and 5 pieces on the current piano syllabus that have repeats marked in if you buy the official edition of it. But don't do them. Please just tell your candidates not to do them. They're not needed and they get in the way of other people's exam times, quite apart from anything else. Is there anything else? Anyone have any questions?
เป็นย้อนนะครับถ้าไม่ได้ย้อนฟอร์มนะครับแต่คาโฟถ้าย้อนธรรมดาไม่ต้องโชว์ออฟว่าจะเล่นการรอบหนึ่งเบารอบหนึ่งนะครับให้จบไปเลย I have a question then from the audience. Back to the sight reading. If the student at a very young age, he or she is very hesitant, in order to get higher marks than just playing very reluctantly, or just skip the notes to the very, very fluent ones, which one, in your opinion as an examiner, will get more marks?
So you're saying you're comparing a hesitant one with
Yes.
somebody who misses things out.
Yes, jump to the one that he or she can play more fluently in the same passage. In the same
Well,
passage.
in a sense, they're both problems, aren't they? They're both going to be losing marks. My personal feeling is that anything that allows the piece to retain momentum is a good thing. Hesitation results in a lack of musical coherence from the listener, and I think it's really important that you're able to keep the thing moving as much as possible. That doesn't mean leaving out 2 whole bars, jumping to the place that you feel more secure, because then the examiner's going to say it was going quite nicely, but you missed out several bars in the middle, you know. So that's clearly. If you were sight reading in the context of an orchestra, and you had a horrible flute part to play, it was terribly difficult, and the conductor's going 1, 2, 1, 2. Then a good thing you would encourage your students to do is to keep counting and to jump back in the right place. Yeah? So that's sort of the logic you're talking about, isn't it? And that's quite different, because the whole music, the passage of musical time is carrying on even though you have stopped playing. So you go, and come back in it. So that's good sight reading, actually, because you're rescuing the situation. You're not saying, sorry, conductor, let's start again. I hope that sort of answers.
หวังว่าคนเมื่อกี้ใครถามนะครับผมจำหน้าไม่ได้ใครถามตกลงได้คำตอบไหมครับ so did you get the answer ก็ถามว่าเวลาเราเล่นเนี่ยมันจะตรงไหนเป็นเด็กๆเล่นยากหรือจะจำเป็นตรงที่เล่นง่ายอันไหนได้คะแนนมากกว่ากันฟังแล้วเนี่ยคงไม่ดีทั้งคู่นะครับเพราะว่า the hesitation หรือการลังเลเนี่ยอันนี้ไม่ดีแต่ถ้าข้ามโน้ตไปเยอะๆแล้วเล่นได้มันก็หายโน้ตไปสรุปว่ากลับไปเรื่องแรกนะครับทำให้ดีดีกว่าครับ we can compensate that with that joke.
So I wish you the best of luck with all your future candidates. Make your lessons as lively and fun as you can, and remember to allow them to enjoy what they're doing. If they have ideas of their own they want to bring to a performance, even if they're slightly different from what's written, if they're making sense of the music, the examiner would rather hear that than something which is a bit dull, a bit unimaginative. So I quite often find myself, not just in Thailand but anywhere in the world, saying things like, you now have the notes and the rhythms under control, this is efficient playing, but it lacks inventiveness, or it needs a bit more creativity, or spontaneity. And I'm sure you know what I mean by that. So encourage them to be a little bit more free and flexible. You know, we have this notion that as classical musicians, we are following every detail on the page, and jazz musicians can do what they like. That's what we think, but that's wrong, really. It's all about making sure the decisions you make stylistically are appropriate, but there's got to be some heart there as well. There's got to be some real feeling with it. So encourage your pupils to have a real feeling for the shape and to love the music they're playing. And the examiner will be persuaded by that. You know? We love it when we hear young students sit there and make a beautiful shapely phrase. It's at last somebody who understands the shape of that phrase, rather than dun 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 dun. It's right. I can't fail it. It's correct. It doesn't do anything. It misses the point. So you can encourage them a lot in that direction. Just a little thing here and there makes all the difference. It really does. So otherwise, it's like food with no spices, no, it's just boring. No salt, no chili, no.
ก็ใช่นะครับอาจารย์จริงๆเล่นดนตรีให้มันมีชีวิตนะครับมีอะไรสักหน่อยทำอะไรสักนิดนึงก็ยังดีนะครับที่จะเล่นแต่โน้ตถูกโน้ตน่าเบื่อครับอาจารย์ก็อยากอะไรครับแต่เรากินอาหารแล้วมันไม่มีเกลือไม่มีพริกไทยไม่มีอะไรเลยไม่ไหวนะครับทำมาสักนิดนึงให้คนฉันได้ฟังให้ enjoy นะครับเล่นดนตรีจากหัวใจนะ
Good luck in your future teaching.
โอเคนะครับ behalf of the Jurat Music School, thank you so much for having a very, very useful and very healthy, fresh idea to recharge us as the whole piano teachers or other music teachers to be more enthusiastic and have something more to tell their students with a freshly mind. Okay, thank you so much and have a very safe trip home. Bye-bye. Thank you. ทุกคนอย่าลืมไปรับใบเซอร์ที่เคาน์เตอร์นะครับขอบคุณครับ